Thank you all. Thank you, Scott, and I want to begin by thanking Chairman Richard Bennett for his remarks. Richard and I have been friends a long time, and he does a phenomenal job, and the school kids of Mississippi are fortunate to have him as chairman of the Education Committee in the Mississippi House of Representatives, just like they've been very fortunate to have Gray Tollison as chairman in the Senate for the last 7 years. Richard Bennett's sister, and I happen to know this, Richard Bennett's sister serves on a school board in which my mama-in-law was a principal for many years. And so to say that we've worked closely together would be an understatement. And oh, by the way, if you kind of got bored listening to the statistics that he was giving, then I would suggest you maybe close your ears now, because I'm going to talk a little bit about them too, because they're so critically important. For far too long in Mississippi, the only judge by some of one's commitment to education was based upon inputs. How much money are you willing to spend? And while that's critically important, and while I am proud that by the time we end this legislative session, we will most likely over the 8 years spend over $400 million more on public education than was spent the year before we got elected. And that's critically important. But now the conversation is not just about inputs, it's also about outcomes. Because outcomes and whether or not our kids can compete is what's critically important. Richard talked about the early learning collaboratives that were put into place that is literally considered a national model for having young people learn, but also for ensuring that there are accountability measures in place so that every penny that is spent in the most effective and efficient manner possible. Not only are we talking about the early learning collaboratives, but the school district consolidations, with the goal of ensuring that the more money that we spend, we believe that the best way for every kid to get a quality education is to have a quality teacher in every classroom. And the best way to have a quality teacher in every classroom is to spend more money in the classroom and less money in the district office. And when Richard talked about the Literacy Promotion Act, when it was originally passed, the third grade gate, there were a lot of people in the establishment who said, no, you can't do this. They said, if you pass this legislation, 50% of third graders are going to be held back, and it's going to mess up the whole system. But that's not all what happened, at least partially because we spent $15 million a year over the last 3+ years, almost $50 million on reading coaches. But what in essence has happened is the very first year, 85% of third graders passed the test on the first try. 92% passed it by the third try. The second year, last year, 92%, as Richard said, passed it on the first try, and over 97% of third graders passed the test. Why is that important? It's obvious why it's important. It's important because if you're a young person that's leaving the third grade, going to the fourth grade, and you're having a hard time reading, the likelihood that you're going to be able to do your math and your science and your social studies and your English homework is relatively low. And the likelihood that when you get in the 7th, 8th, and 9th grade, then you may become a statistic or a dropout is relatively high. As you've heard me say many times before, we believe strongly that in between pre-kindergarten and third grade, kids need to be learning to read. But once they leave the third grade, they better no longer be learning to read, they better be reading to learn. And so as you look at the focus that we've had over these last 7 years in terms of positive legislation that ensures that we are getting more money in the classroom and ensures that there are accountability measures in place, the outcomes and the statistics that Richard mentioned really speak for themselves. The fact of the matter is that in 2010, the high school graduation rate nationally was about 82.5%. In Mississippi, it was in the low 70 percentile range, 70.5 or so. We were 12 points below the national average just 8 years ago. Last year, the national graduation rate, high school graduation rate, had risen about 1%, a little less, So now the high school graduation rate nationally is about 83.5%. Mississippi's high school graduation rate is up almost 12 percentage points. We're at 82.5%, and if we continue on this trajectory, we'll exceed the national average within the next year or so. Now, the national average isn't good enough, and we're not going to quit, and we're not going to stop, and we're going to keep pushing. But the movement that has occurred over these 7 years is really quite miraculous. And by the way, it's something that we ought to all be on the same page, no matter your political views, no matter your political stripes. We ought to all be saying thank you to everyone who has made this happen. And we ought to, because I believe, and I'll tell you this, I believe success begets success. And there are a lot of these statistics that really aren't written about, and they aren't talked about a whole lot. And I don't know why. Perhaps it's because, as former Governor Barber used to say, the press rarely covers an airplane that lands safely. But the fact of the matter is, we'd all be better off if we spent more time bragging about the good things that are going on in our schools, because success does in fact beget success. But I'll also tell you that improving the graduation rate by 10 to 12 percentage points, that looks great on paper, but you know what it means in the real world? What it means in the real world is there's approximately 3,000 kids today that are going to graduate high school this year that would not have in 2010. That's 3,000 kids that have a totally different outlook on life. They have a totally different set of opportunities because they were willing to make the sacrifice to stay in school and get that degree. But as Richard said earlier, the successes that's being experienced in our schools is not just limited to high school graduates. A lot of us talk a lot about high school graduates because high school graduates end up in the workforce the next year, many of them, not all, but many of them. And you know, politicians tend to define the long term based upon whatever is the next election day. And so sometimes you don't hear them talk a lot about what's going on in 4th grade reading and 4th grade math, or 8th grade reading and 8th grade math results, because they're not going to change the dynamics of the workforce for many years to come. But the fact of the matter is, the statistics that Richard mentioned as it relates to our nation's report card, the NAEP testing, are even more impressive than the increase in graduation rates, and even more important to the future of our state. I know MEC is focused on workforce development, and I'm so honored that you are and so happy that you are, because it's critically important. As you all know, in the Mississippi Works website, we have over 40,000 jobs available in Mississippi that are simply waiting for the right person with the right skill set to be available to fill those jobs. That's with the lowest unemployment rate in our state's history, and that's with more people working today in Mississippi than at any time in our state's history. But when we think about what's going to be the case 10 years from now, 15 years from now, 20 years from now, and as business leaders and as elected leaders, that's what we need to be thinking about, is what's going to happen 10, 15, 20 years from now. These are the statistics that get me excited. You know, if you're on a list of 1 to 20, and you're at number 20 or 19, the only way you can move up that list is if you consistently, on a year-over-year basis, outperform your peers. You're not going to go from 20th to 1st overnight. You didn't get 20th overnight. You're not going to go from 20th to 1st overnight. But if you, year after year after year, consistently outperform on a relative basis, that's how you move up on an absolute basis in the charts. Richard briefly mentioned these stats, but I'm going to say them again because I think they need to be repeated. And I hope every one of you will write this down and you'll go back to your local communities and you'll thank a teacher, or you'll thank an administrator, or you'll thank a parent, or you'll thank some of our kids for putting in the effort to make this happen. The fact of the matter is, the worst Mississippi has done in terms of 10-year growth rates on the nation's report card is in 8th grade reading. In 8th grade reading over the last 10 years, our year-over-year improvement for a 10-year period beats 37 other states, and we're 12th in the nation in gains. In 8th grade math, we're 7th in the nation in gains in 8th grade math. When it comes to 4th grade math, Mississippi is 4th in the nation for 10-year gains in 4th grade math. And we talked a lot about the Literacy Promotion Act. But in 4th grade reading scores on the nation's report card, Mississippi outperforms 48 other states over the last 10 years, and we're 2nd in the nation for gains in 4th grade reading. My friends, those are outcomes that we can all be proud of. And I tell you this not because I think anyone in this building deserves credit. All we did is try to raise the level of expectations. We just tried to raise the level of expectations. And Mississippi administrators and teachers and parents, and yes, most importantly, Mississippi kids, they did what Mississippians do. They rose up and they met those increased expectations. And so, as we look to the kind of policies that we want to enact from a legislative standpoint, from an executive branch standpoint in the coming years, I hope we'll continue to focus on the belief that Mississippi kids can compete. Mississippi kids can outperform kids from states like Alabama and countries from all over the world. But all of the policies that we've implemented over the last 7 years, and there's been a lot of them, and trust me when I tell you I got the bullet holes to show for it, but all of the policies that we've implemented have been based upon one fundamental belief. And that fundamental belief is this: it should not matter what a kid's zip code is, nor should it matter what their mom and dad do, or in some instances don't do for a living. Every kid in Mississippi deserves an opportunity for success. If we're going to see economic success in rural communities across Mississippi, we got to improve the quality of the education attainment level in rural Mississippi. If we're going to see further economic opportunities in the metro areas, we got to improve the quality of the education attainment level in metro areas. And so I will tell you that I look forward to working with each of you, much like we have done over the last 7 years. You know, the goal of having no more elected school superintendents has been a goal of the Mississippi Economic Council, I think, since the beginning of time. It was a goal that MEC had been unsuccessful in getting done for many years. But thanks to the leadership of Speaker Gunn and other leaders in the Senate, and with the governor's support, we will not have elections for school superintendents in 2019 in Mississippi. Our superintendents can focus on doing what's best for kids and not focus on doing what's best to get themselves reelected. Because the fact of the matter is, I grew up in Florence, went to Florence High School, and I can assure you, and by the way, our football coach was Coach Lee Bramlett, a great friend of mine. His wife taught me English. I can assure you, when Coach Bramlett left after my junior year in high school, the Rankin County School District did not limit our search to replace Coach Bramlett to just those who lived in the city of Florence. They did not limit the search for a head football coach just to those who lived in Rankin County. And so if we're not going to limit going out and looking for talent to be the head football coach at our schools around the state, why on earth should we limit those who are going to actually lead the district and force them to have to come from and live in that particular district? What we ought to do is we ought to put in a system whereby the best, most qualified, most capable candidate. And by the way, this was not easy, because a lot of us believe in elections in Mississippi. We like to elect everything from state senators to governors to dog catchers in Mississippi, and I get it. But I think this is one area where the legislature, even though it may not have been popular, did the right thing. And I hope that in hearing me talk today, you have heard that while a lot of the pieces of legislation that we've championed and enacted and supported and gotten done that have led to true positive results, a lot of them weren't necessarily popular, but we made the decision based upon what we thought was best for school kids across our state. So as we embark upon the next 87 days and 6 hours of this legislative session, not that I'm keeping count or anything, but as we embark upon that, let me say to each of you, I look forward to working with you and your leadership. And by the way, Scott's doing a fantastic job leading this organization. We communicate with him on a regular basis. We did so when we went through a period of time where we didn't agree on everything, and we do so now as well. Because I know, and I believe he knows, that each and every one of you in this room and I have at least one thing in common, and that is this: we want what's best for our great state. We want to continue to make sure that our purpose and our views and our beliefs are focused on the main thing, and the main thing is making Mississippi an even better place to invest capital, to create jobs, and an even better place to raise a family. Thank y'all.